I'll move the source photograph, come back to that in a moment. On paper, I'm using a watercolor paper. This is actually Arches cold pressed or knot paper. It's 300 grams per square meter, and it is cotton rag, so it's very good quality absorbent watercolor paper. I would always advise that if at all possible that you get a good quality paper. Secondly, I'm pointing out here my paint palettes that I have here, and I won't go through each of those at the moment. We'll address some of these as the demonstration occurs, only to say that they are good quality artists' pigments. Most of them are translucent, but not all. And the one that certainly isn't translucent is this white gouache, which I will be using at the very end of the painting. And thirdly, on materials and equipment, I have a number of brushes here. I think I'll be using all 4 of those, and I will talk about each brush in turn as I use the brushes. Lastly, I have a water spray bottle. This is something that I don't always use, but in this particular occasion, where I'm trying to get quite a lot of wet-on-wet atmospheric paint on the paper, I think I'll find that wetting the paper and keeping it moist will help me spread the colors around. It's not essential you use a bottle like this, but what you might find very useful is to put a lot of water on your paper. And we'll talk about that as the demonstration proceeds. This is the source photograph I'm using. It's a photograph taken, in fact, it's a still taken from a video that a niece of mine sent me, who was running. This is in Essex, the River Colne, near Colchester. And I liked the video so much, and I liked the atmosphere of the video, that I got, with her permission, extracted a frame from this. And this is why I suppose really it's quite a blurred, not very distinct photograph, but I think that's great to work from. Most of all, though, it was the early morning sunrise atmosphere on the flat, calm river, bouncing off the boats, the light bouncing off the boats, and the background providing some sort of a dark color, a darkness against the light that is coming on the water and on the boats. So that is the source that I'm using here. And I think before I start painting, as far as your painting is concerned, please feel absolutely free to change things as you wish. I will, for instance, put in 3 boats here, but if you want to put in 1 or none, or more boats, or if you want to move things around, especially if you want to alter the type of colors that I'm going to be using, that's entirely up to you. I mean, I would like to think that everyone here will produce something slightly different, and not everyone doing exactly the same as me. So on to the 4 stages that I mentioned earlier. I suppose if I were painting this without having a class in front of me, these would run on fairly seamlessly. But it's useful to break them into these sections. The first one combines really looking at the composition and making a drawing wherever the drawing might be necessary. The second, putting down washes. The third, adding more color, intensity, shadows, and that sort of thing. And the fourth and last session is about any finishing touches that are needed just to bring the whole painting together. A word then on the composition. I'm going to draw now and talk about the composition, but basically the line where the water of the river joins the bank, which is fairly indistinct, but you can sort of make it out. It is kind of a line of, I'm sort of treating that as my horizon. I'm going to put above that a bank and trees disappearing into the light. And below that, I'm going to be putting the reflections of that bank and particularly those trees. And then in amongst that will be the boats. So probably the first decision I need to make is, where do I want this line, which is, as I said, where the water joins the bank, where do I want that line to appear on my paper here? And I want it to give me enough room to put in the bank and the trees and some sky, and enough room to give me the water, the reflections, the boats, and in particular, the reflections of the masts. So I'm going for something just about a third of the way up the paper here. And also it kind of narrows down as things get smaller and go away from you. So let me begin that drawing here. If I think this is where roughly I'm going to have the line. Oh, I go a bit higher than that. The line of the water joining the bank. That gives me enough room to have something of the bank. It's very difficult to see the bank here, and then something of the trees here. Let's make some marks. I don't have to follow them slavishly. I'm using a soft 4B pencil, so any pencil marks that I wish to get rid of later, I can do so by rubbing them out fairly easily. I quite like that there might be one or two prominent bits on them, like there's obviously a tree of some kind there, because that is reflected in the water. And so my reflections go something interesting. Looking at the photograph, they tend to be more linear, these reflections. They're not picking up all of the non-symmetrical trees up here. So that gives me that dark band left to right, or horizontal on my painting. Now I'm going to put in some boats. As you will see from my demonstration painting that I did a while back, there's not a lot of detail in these boats. So if you're worried about drawing boats, I'll go through it now just to point out what I think might be the main features, but pretty much anything will do as a boat, because it's going to get lost in, a lot of it's going to get lost in this light. So let's start off. I said I was going to follow the photograph, so I'll put it, shove it under here, so you've got that. You can't see it. I have a smaller one. I don't know if that would help. Got this little smaller one here for a moment. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to start off with this large boat here. Now, interestingly, one or two little things that even at this stage of the painting would be useful to be aware of is that I had mentioned that we've got the light bouncing off parts of the boats and coming up on the rigging and that sort of thing. They are the lightest parts of the painting entirely. But if you want anything to appear brighter, then put it next to something darker. So you take a look at the bow of this boat here, as it happens in the photograph, but it's something that you could play on as the artist making the painting. As it happens, that brightness is emphasized by the darkness of the reflections around it. It doesn't happen quite so much for these boats because they're getting lost a little bit anyway. Similarly, there is light coming through in the bimini top windows on this boat. You can see how it's glowing a little bit through there. Well, that is emphasized, of course, because of the darkness around it. So the reason I mentioned that is that it might help me in placing in the boat, or at least I could put the boat where I want and bring the reflections down. So I'm going to, this big boat dominates this right hand of the picture. So if I put it so that the bow is like that, hope that makes sense. There's a sort of fender up there, and just put in a boat shape here. That'd be about the boat, and put in this bimini top. A little bit of substructure on the boat, and bow, and it might be useful just to suggest also where the reflection of this might be. And you can change it just as much as you like. You go on, but it just made some suggestion there, and I'll put in the mast, maybe a bit of rigging. So that's put in the main boat. Pop in a couple of other boats. I'm gonna bring these over to the left-hand side of the paper here, and whether they are smaller or not, I'm going to make them smaller boats, and I'll put one the bottom of it about there. Whatever kind of boats you want to put in, really, they can be the same boat type of boats, or but they've got masts anyway, and they've got some sort of maybe a substructure here. One boat, a little bit of a reflection, and pop in something of a mast. These masts will largely be missed out, really, with all the light on them, depending on how intense you want to make that light, and just something of a something of a reflection here. That's that boat. I'll pop another one down here. Where should I put it? I'm just looking at the sort of spaces between them, and let's put this one up reasonably close to that one. And if you think you're making your drawing too detailed for the atmospheric quality of the light, then of course we can lose so much of that drawing in the colors and all the water and the paint that's going to go on. Right. I can't see any buildings down here, but I'm going to make some of this skyline just a little bit angular, so it might suggest that there are some buildings there, whereas the trees are much more fluid and unpredictable in their shapes. So what one or two shapes that might suggest there's a warehouse or buildings down there. And these pencil marks, in fact, I've left them in this. I've just made one or two little marks here, and I quite like the pencil marks left in, but that's again entirely a decision for you. That's it. Let me see whether I need to do any more drawing. I don't think so. Right, that takes me to the end of that first stage where we have been looking at the composition and thinking about how we might alter it or how we might make it work for us in our painting. Then making some drawn marks. I've been using a soft pencil, so I can rub the marks out later if I should wish to do so. And putting in, I prefer to put in really only what I think is necessary, and even sometimes less than that. I've maybe put in a little bit more here than I might normally do, just working on my own. But I'm aware that it can all change. It can all change later on as you're painting. But that takes me to the end of that. So my next stage, stage 2, is going to be about putting washes on. Excuse me, I'm going to have a drink. Now, the thing about putting washes on is that you're looking at the lightest colors. We'll move on into darker colors later on, but if in doubt, make your colors lighter than you think you need to make them. You can always darken them up later. But the atmosphere, the tone, the feel of the painting is so much made up with this first stage, and by the end of it, it'll look very wishy-washy. In fact, for this particular painting, I'm hoping it will. But keep everything as light as possible. Now, in this particular painting, what appealed to me instantly when I saw my niece's film and extracted a frame from it was the atmosphere, that feeling of early morning light. She's a great runner, so she would have been warm running, but if you're standing there, it's probably quite cold. You've got this warmth coming from the sun, this early morning sun. You've got the coldness of the sky still, and it's that atmosphere and the fact that you're almost blinded by all the light coming here. It's cutting out a lot of the detail that you would see later in the day when the light rises a little bit higher. So my approach to getting that atmosphere is going to be about using a lot of water and having as much as I can wet colors running into wet colors. There's going to be need for some detail, some harder edges, but I'll keep those to a minimum in order to get this sort of flooded feel. This photograph, this one I printed with a different printer, shows it even more. You've really just got this dark bank and some suggestion of boats here. When you do your painting, you must approach it whichever way you like, and in fact, as so often happens in painting, a lot of it's accident. You put something down and you then respond to that, but it may not be what you actually intended doing, but you run with what you've got on the paper. So with all this wetness and everything else that I've been talking about, I'm going to wets my paper right from the outset and drop in colors so that they drop in pigments so that they are moved around the paper with the water. That's why I'm going to use this. If I didn't have this, then I'd pick up a big brush and pick up water with it and slop it over here. So much about watercolor painting is about being aware of how much paint you have on your paper, on your brush, together with the pigment you're going. So it might be that even with the spray that you think, oh, I've flooded too much water onto my paper. Well, no, that's easily remedied by, say, getting a bit of tissue and just wiping it, damping it down and lifting the water off. But whatever you do, to be aware of how much water is on your paper and your brush and what the amount of pigment you're using will help enormously. So I'm going to flood this with water here, but or spray it with water lightly so that the paper does become damp. If I need more water, I'll do some more sprays, or if I need less, I'll take it off with the tissue as I suggested. I get my spray. Right, that's certainly wet it. I hold the board up. I think I can make that a little wetter. You hold it up so you get the light slanting off it. And you'll and of course, whilst I'm talking, looking at it, it will the water will be seeping into this paper. Remember, I told you we talked about this good quality cotton rag absorbent watercolor paper. This is where it's really doing its work for you. It's absorbing the liquid, as opposed to many other papers which will have a more polished surface, and the liquid tends to stay on the surface of the paper. You often get harder edges as a result of that. Okay, so there we are. It's wet. I can come back to it later on if I do. So I'm going to use this brush to start off with. It's a squirrel hair mop brush, 1 inch. This is pure squirrel, but imitation squirrel is really good as well. And they're not vastly expensive brushes like this. In fact, none of the 4 brushes I might be using are very expensive brushes. And as far as the colors are concerned, I talked about this warm light coming in and talked about the coolness that it's coming into. So I'm trying to get some suggestion of that in this early stage of the painting. I'll begin by putting something into the sky. That sky is reflected in part in the water here, and I'll do that and then bring in the yellowness that's coming in the sky. So if we look to my paints, I've got 3 blues that I could choose from here for the sky. I have this one, cerulean blue, cobalt, and French ultramarine. The cerulean is the coolest of these blues. It has more yellow in it, thus making it appear slightly greener. The cobalt, and at the other end is the French ultramarine, which has more red in it, thus giving it a warmer, almost more purple feel. And somewhere in the middle is this cobalt. So I'm going to use the cooler blue and put that in. Sky, how are we doing? I'll pick up some water, pick up some of this cobalt blue, and put that in here. That's almost not good enough water on my I want to get some light coming around the tops of the trees, so I'll take away some of that blue. That might be enough, and let's bring some of that down here. Or maybe in the photograph, the water down here appears quite dark. I'm not sure why exactly that's happening. Maybe it's because you're from where the photograph is taken, you're able to look into the water and it is darker. But I quite like it's darker there. But so I can come back and do something about that a little later on. So there we have something of sky. Let's just put a bit of water there. And here I'll turn my attention to the sun that's coming in and the light that's coming in here. Remember, we're looking at what is the lightest part of the painting in when we're doing this second stage, which is our wash stage. So have a look at some of the yellows I've got. The three main yellows I could play with are, this is called New Gamboge, which has quite a lot of red in it and gives it a very warm feel. And then at the other end is lemon yellow, which has some more blue in it, which gives it a greener, cooler feel. And then rather like the blue, somewhere in the middle is this color called Aurelian, which is sort of midway. Now, if you don't have these colors exactly, there are lots of other colors that will work happily for you. For instance, if you don't have Aurelian, cadmium yellow would work fine for that. I have something called raw sienna, which has got yellow in it. I might use, and yellow ochre here, which I might use in a moment. But I'm going to start off. Is it wet enough? Let's have a look. Start off with putting some lemon yellow down here and bringing that into touching the blue. Because this paper's so wet, the blue and the yellow will start to merge in a little bit and give this sort of softness, and I'll bring some of that down here. So at the moment I've just put in yellow, lemon yellow. Now, it depends on how intense you want this yellow to be. If you want it not to be so intense, for instance, if we look at that photograph and we compare it with what I put in on the demonstration I did there, I've obviously put a lot more yellow into my painting than comes out in the photograph. Now, if you wanted to sort of get rid of some of that, you again go back with your tissue and just remove that a little bit. But I don't just want it to be yellow. I want there to be some warmth coming into this yellow. So I'll move towards Aurelian, and as you can see, that's slightly warmer, and just put some of that down here, particularly in the reflections. Just a little bit, not covering everything, but just in places. And what is literally happening here as we're talking is it's painting itself. This picture, the paint is doing all the work. Let's just bring a bit more yellow here. Warm yellow. There. And where you've got the light glinting off the boats, you've got this sort of yellowness light glinting off the boats. It's quite nice to have some of that yellow actually on the boat so that we'll be able to do something with that. For instance, the bow of this boat here picks up a lot of the yellow of the light that's coming in here. And so I've deliberately made sure I brought some yellow over that. The whole painting's quite wet at the moment. I think that's really as far as I think I'll go with. Yeah, that's as far as I'll go with the wash stage, the second stage, the wash stage of the painting. Now, before we move on to the next stage, the third stage, where we're going to be putting more colours on, I want the paper to be bone dry. In some ways, it's not quite so important it's bone dry for this one, because there's still a lot of fluidity here that I want in the atmosphere. But nearly always, I'd prefer to work on bone dry. Now, this is quite wet. It's had a fair amount of water on it. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to dry this with my hairdryer. Just a word on using hairdryers. I try and avoid them wherever I can. I much prefer the absorbency of the paper and the water and the pigments to be painting themselves whilst they're drying. But in terms of this demonstration, I'm going to use the hairdryer. One of the problems with the hairdryer is that if you use it too fiercely, it can spread, well, it can spread the paint out, yes, if that's very fierce, but it can also stop that process of the colours blending into each other. So I will, without doing it too fiercely, I will now dry this painting, second stage, before I move on to the third stage. So here we go. Stage 3, step 3 of this painting, having sorted out our composition and the drawing in the first stage, and put the light washes down, the colours for the lightest parts of the painting down in the second stage. I'm going to the third stage, where I'm going to probably put most of the painting in. There more colours, more tones, and wherever necessary, any more detail. But in this painting, remember, I'm trying to keep the whole thing fairly atmospheric and wet on wet. So I don't want there to be too many hard edges here. So I will probably be refreshing the wetness of this painting with water, either with this spray or just by using water. Let's have a look at the source photograph briefly whilst we go on to it. This band here, it's almost the first thing you see when you see look at the picture. I mean, because it's the first thing you see, you also immediately see the lightness around it, which makes the band. But in this other photograph I've got here, you can see how it is almost the darkness of the trees and the other part of the other side of the river that's showing up. So that's something that needs to be that I intend making a fairly strong statement about. But of course, it disappears into the light here. So I've just got to be careful of how dark I make it, where I make it light, and where I make it hard edged and where I keep it soft edged. The colors I'm going to use for this are I'll put in some yellow ochre here. Particularly, I'll drop that in this area here where there's some suggestion of a bank, pathway or bank, and and also I'm going to use a brown. I think I'll use this raw sienna. Yeah, raw umber. So I've got yellow ochre, raw umber. I could use this color that I have up here, which is a burnt umber. The difference between the two is that this one, the raw umber, has more blue in it, is cooler, and the burnt umber here has more red in it, which makes it a bit warmer. I'm going to go for the cooler brown, but I'm going to be mixing some blue into it to get the darkness, further darkness to the trees and so forth. And the color that I'll use for that will be the French ultramarine here, which is the one, as I mentioned earlier, has more red in it, and so it's warmer. So I'll be putting a warmer blue on top of with a cooler brown here. I think if I used the burnt umber which has red in it, and the French ultramarine, which also has red in it, I think it's going to be too warm. It's going to be too reddy. So I'll put that in here. Around and mixing into the yellow ochre, and then the reflections here. I will use some of those colors. If you look at the photograph, it's a bit lighter reflection here than it is some up there. Now, before I do that, also, I spoke about having hard edges in this painting. Well, in keeping with everything being that soft light, which is sort of almost blinding you, I just want to be a bit careful about how hard my edges are, say, for instance, at the top of these trees. They get softer and softer and almost sort of disappear down there. And so I want them to be relatively soft, a bit harder here, but getting softer, as indeed is the same with all of the background. I'm going to bring all of this and the reflection down around the boats, and then I'll deal with the boats and the water and other things a little bit later on. So my first bit of painting is going to be this dark band here, and making a statement about that. If I need to put any more little details in, I can do that right at the end. So I said that I'd be using this raw umber and this yellow ochre. So let's put in a bit of this. Now, I have to make a decision here. How wet do I want my paper? I want it a little bit wet. Let's just put a little bit. No, that could have been done just as easily with a brush with water on it. Let's pick up now. Having put a lot of water, having put a certain amount of water, and I'm still using this big brush, by the way, this big mop brush. I'll move on to other brushes in a moment. Having put water on here, I said at the start how important it is that you're aware of how much water might be on your paper or your brush. So, there's quite a bit on there. The point is, how much water do I then pick up in my brush to pick up the yellow ochre? Well, I don't really need that much because there is water already on the paper. Let's just put a little bit of that in. Yeah, let's see. That's already sort of just running itself into the rest of it here, and I'll pick up this color, the raw umber that I mentioned. it's just decisions. You're looking at how wet it is. Am I going to get here? It's drier, harder edge. Here it's softer because the spray didn't cover it all equally. Just using the edge of the brush that might break it up a little bit there, and similarly, I'm going to bring that down to around the boat. At the moment, I'm just using the raw umber. Let's put some of that there. Leave a little, if I can try and remember it, a couple of little gaps for the lights that's bouncing off some of the structures of the boats. All right, let's pick up a little bit more yellow ochre and just bring a bit of that down here. That's a bit too intense, but I'll come back to that in a moment. Going back up here, I talked about using a blue, so let's drop some more stronger pieces of that brown in here, and then come across to this French ultramarine and pop that in there. As I've mentioned already a couple of times, it's very much painting itself, this painting, as it goes along. And we must allow the paint to do its work. It's very good at that. So let's pick up my smaller mop brush here. Exactly the same squirrel hair as this one here, and bring in some blue and start to suggest maybe some of the, these straight edge buildings that I mentioned, just some of the angles. Let that work in. This tree is reflected below it. Here you're making a decision, just how dark do you want things to be. I think I'd like them to be a little bit darker. And I can, by stubbing this brush in, you can see it gives it a very rough edge. I can maybe make some marks which suggest tops of trees and things being a little bit broken up in that way. This is too intense here, so I'm going to take that out a little bit with a tissue and maybe just add a little bit of blue. Wee bit. Now you'll find each of you will tackle this in a slightly different way, and therefore, with luck, you'll all come up with different paintings. But a lot of it will be accidental. You think things are happening that you can't really predict. And that's such a nice feature of particularly watercolor painting. So don't worry about that. Soften some of these edges. Once they're still wet with a bit of the edge of a tissue here. I don't want any hard edges down, particularly down where the sun is. Let's clear some of those. Make this a bit darker here. And a bit more darker blue here. I'll make these trees a bit higher. There. This blue is mixing in with the brown that was there. If I want, I've just added a bit more brown just to increase some of the darkness there. And no harm in it. Doesn't all have to be consistently exactly the same. Where the water joins the water's edge, which is about here, that first line I drew, right, just, it's all very wet. I might just pop in a bit of blue there. It's quite strong pigment. And that should give us some sort of a suggestion that that's where the water goes to. That first colour I put in, which was yellow ochre here, I'd try and get some suggestion that there might be a pathway running down here. And that's disappearing off into there. Do I reduce that even more? Yeah, and come back and look at that if I need to. I wanted, remember I spoke to you about putting some dark against the bow. I haven't really done that too successfully. It's just watch it again. And the people worry an awful lot about these cauliflowers or blossoms, I think a lot of people call them, that appear when you put something too wet onto something that's drying. Well, I don't think we got much of a chance of that happening here because everything's pretty wet here anyway. So that's not going to be a problem we're going to face. Maybe I will leave that like that at this stage. Yeah. If I feel I need to do any more to it, I can maybe tackle that a little later on. But I'm going to move on now down to the boats. Now we're still in this third stage of the painting where we're putting more colours on, and we haven't got to the end where we'll look and see whether any little details need to be included. So I'm going to move now down to the boats, putting the reflections in as well of the boat, and maybe one or two little details on the structure, but trying to keep some of the areas light where the light is reflecting of it. Now you can see there's light reflecting from this mast here. I haven't allowed for that. If I were working much more finely, maybe I would. But I'm going to, at the end, touch in some highlights on that mast using some gouache. So I've overcome that. But in some areas, I've tried to keep the light there, especially when I want the light to be more yellow than just white of a highlight. Okay, I'm going back to my mop brush here. this and the other one, they're great brushes. They're not desperately expensive. Uh, whether this is squirrel here, but imitation, as I said before, would be quite useful. But it's quite nice how you can pick up a lot of water with them. You can get some sharp edges, even on this. Let me get the big one out, fill it up with water, and flick it on my floor. And I've got some sharp edges that I can use there for doing some more fine detail. But I'm coming in here to the boats. All right. There's not a lot of detail in this painting, so I can be minimalist in what detail I put in, but I want to bring the shadow which is on the side of this boat in particular. I want to show that because that's away from the light that's coming into it, but also the reflection. So I'll go back to this sludgy mixture that I've got here from the raw umber and the French ultramarine colors, and let's see if I can start off with that. That's quite blue. Is that what I want? Maybe it is. Let's have a look. So we'll put in some of the sort of shadow areas to the boat here. Now I haven't wet the paper for this. It is still slightly wet. If I feel that I want to continue with this softness, then I can add more water to it, or I can even sort of liven up and spray it afterwards. It's still wet. Yeah, let's just bring in some of that structure here. One or two little bits of catching the light on the boat. And it's reflected here. Put a little bit more brown in. There is a line where the bottom of the boat touches the water. We'll deal with that in a moment. And also there is a softness of how the light comes around the front, the bow of the boat. So at the moment, putting this wet paint on dry paper, I'm not getting that softness. So I think what I'll do is I'll just get a bit of clean water. There are a number of ways of doing this, and just put a little bit there, go back to my dark colors, and where they touch the water, you'll see them starting to again paint themselves. Very, very useful having paint that does have the work for you. You can also, if you want to just soften edges of paint, just use your finger and touch it on there, and you can see we've got some sort of softness appearing here. Pick up a bit more blue, and this Bimini top, I'm going to paint that later, maybe even in the fourth stage, because it's all a bit wet here. And the paint's flooding around a little bit, but it's not too wet here. So I'll add something a little bit blue, just and also, again, I want to suggest where the boat meets the water, but it's a little bit too wet. If I, just at the moment, it's a little bit too wet. So I'll come back to that in a moment. Yeah, it's a little bit too wet. So this mast, reflection of the mast. There's no reason why I shouldn't do it now, is there? No, I can't think of it. No, I'll do it at the end. I'll come back to it and do it at the end. Right, that boat's a little bit too wet there to work on, so I'm going to move on down to these boats. Now, you can't see much of these boats at all, so let's hang on to some of the same colour here and put in something dark. You almost lose the detail. It's just, as long as some bits of it catch the light. There's a reflection. Again, if you want to just soften the edge, you could use your finger to do it, or touch in a little bit of water just to soften the edge of that. We'll just bring in some water. And this next one, you can see even less of. Getting easier and easier to paint these boats. Let's pick a little bit more colour. I can hardly see that boat, so depends on how clear you want to make it. Let's just pop in there. I'm going to splotch some water on here just to soften the whole thing. Right, come back to that one. Pick up coming back to this boat now. Then the water might have dried a little bit. I'll pick up some front blue and brown that I've used here, but there's almost no water in that. So because I know I've got water in here, I'll make it stronger. Just let the water that's on the paper water that's on the paper do something. I'll come back to that structure here. Do I need to add a little bit of this whilst it's still a bit wet? You can get away with murder here because you can smother everything with the light that's coming in. How dry is this? This is silence. I'm just trying to work out what I should do next. Let's have a go at that. Let's have a go at that top and see if we can do a little bit more work on that boat. So I'm going to go back to my brown. I haven't used many colours in this painting. We used cerulean blue, sky, reflection. We used some lemon yellow, sky, reflection. We used a bit of Aurelian or cadmium yellow or something like that to bring in a little bit of warmth around that lemon yellow. and then some burnt raw umber with some blue ultramarine here. Oh, and yellow, some yellow ochre. So it's not many colours. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, it's funny. You'll find a lot of artists end up using between 5 and 7 colours in their paintings anyway. So we're doing all right in that respect. Soften that. Oh yeah, I was going to look at this bin on the top. Let's just have a look. I quite like the sort of the blueness that comes out of it. So let's see if this is going to work. And the reflection, the light that comes through the covering, it's something that appealed to me. And let's paid off making sure there was some yellow there. Now, those of you who are sailors here will be appalled at my understanding of boats. Although I do sail. I used to sail a bit of offshore and dinghy sailing, but it looks enough like a boat to me. Let's put something a bit darker at the back here, maybe. And right, that will probably be enough for that. Yeah, so that stands out quite well. And I could use a rigger now. This rigger brush is my oldest brush. It's been repaired so many times. I can't, and it's almost certainly lost a fair amount of hair, but it's a very cheap rigger brush. Interestingly enough, if you were on a desert island, you could only have a limited number of amount of equipment. I would have a big brush and a little brush like that. That's what I go for. And even I digress a little bit here, but this is my set, watercolor set I carry around everywhere. Some of you who I know here might have seen this before. Not really my painting. I've limited the number of colors I've got here, but the point I'm trying to make here is that I've whittled everything down to as big a brush as I can fit in here. So I bought the biggest brush I get, and I cut the handle off, and that just about slots in there. And I got a rigger here and got rid of the brush that was in here, and then with masking tape and things set it up so that I have, if I was stranded on a desert island with nothing else, I just have this big brush, moppy type brush, and a rigger. There are so many other brushes you can use, which are great, of course. Actually, in my mind, the single most important thing of the three, the paper, the paints, and the brushes, is the paper. Because that's the one thing you can't really do anything about. You even if you went for cheaper paints, you could make them work. If you didn't have many brushes, or you had cheaper brushes, you could make them work. You can make one brush do a lot of things, but the paper is something that's much more difficult to get right. So the paper is probably the most important of the three in my mind. Okay, what I'm going to do now is put in the mask, the reflection here, and then I'm going to come back, and I want this to be darker here. I want it to be slightly more mottled, the overall effect, and we'll do that a little later on. So I'm going to go to my rigger brush for this, and pop in the mast down here, some of the rigging, and the reflections of the same here. What particularly the reflections, the only reason I'm wondering whether to do this now or later, I'll do it now, but I don't want them to be too strong. I quite like to paint it in one go rather than have to go over it. So again, I'm using just these colors, the brown and the blue that I've been talking about. Let's put in some of this rigging. Now, I might need to just move my painting around because I'm not as dexterous as I used to be. Let's and when trying to get a reasonably straight line. So having drawn in with the pencil, it's quite useful. Let's have a look at this picture again. Okay, it stands out on the sky, above the skyline very well, but you don't see much other than the highlights when it's lost in the trees. So let's just see, is this going to be too dark? Maybe I'll make it a bit lighter. And the other thing about drawing these lines here is, I'm sure many of you will know this expression of lost and found. So instead of like an architect maybe might religiously draw the straight line here and all the other straight lines, I'm going to, in places, leave the line out, to lose it in a sense, and then find it again. It seems to work as a sort of optical illusion that in a painting, if you do that, people looking at the painting will read that there is a line there, whether it's a telegraph line or a line of fencing or whatever it might be. In this case, it'll be masts and things. They'll read it. Sometimes if you just put the whole line in a painting, it can look a little bit heavy. That's a curious thing, that. Right, let's just take it up here. Thicker up here. Okay. There's a little line there. Let's whilst I'm here, let's put in something of this. Yeah, it's probably going to work. And this one. Right, I'll have a go at these ones without turning things around. Right, we don't see a lot of this one, do we? Let's the finger smudge, just to remove the intensity a little bit down here, maybe. And this one. There we go. Turn this around. Right, put that lot in. Now, this third stage we're on at the moment, I'm thinking about it in this painting, it kind of leads very quickly onto the fourth stage in terms of detail. Quite often the detail tends to be little detail with dark marks or light marks. In this case, I like this sort of mottled effect that you get on both these photographs. I'm going to see if we can reproduce that. And I suppose really it could form part of this third stage, or I could call it the fourth stage. What should I do? Yeah, I'm going to stay with this being the third stage and just put some more darkness and things like that in here, and then we'll take a look at the painting and see what, if anything, we need to do for the final stage. Right, so just I haven't moved on to the fourth stage yet. I'm still fiddling around with this stage, but I'm going to I talked about how I liked it darker hair in the photograph, and so I'm going to do something about that and sort of mottle that around here. But I'm going to use this brush now. Talking about cheap brushes, you don't get them cheaper than this. This is stolen from one of my grandchildren's paint sets, or it could have been. And I just gave it, got a pair of scissors to it and gave it a really bad haircut. But it's quite useful, as you'll see, for sort of getting mottled or effects like that. But you can do exactly the same thing with any brush. You know, if I take, for instance, this mop brush I've been using a lot, and I splay it out, it's got a bad haircut. So it's not really very different from this. It's amazing how few brushes you do need, but I like this. I take it around and then I quite like that. But in making things darker here, I want to be very careful about just introducing hard edges. So I'm going to soften it again, refresh it, and I'll see whether I can finish this stage just by bringing some darker blue in here and taking it around here a little bit. There we go. So I'm not going to do anything in the sky. Let's just see how that goes. Right, the color I want for this. I'm not sure what color. I'm going to just play around with cobalt, see if I bring some cobalt into this. That might be too dark. Well, maybe it's not. Too wet, though. I asked myself. No, let's just. It might be too wet. I'll just dry it a little bit. Okay, let's go on to this. A bit more blue. So some of the cerulean that we put there, that's getting too hard edge there for me. Some of the cerulean we put down on the sky reflected into the river is still showing up. I don't want to cover all of that. Let's see how far I can take this. I got rid of some of the paint on my brush as I'm moving into the yellow here. Bring it across to the yellow. Get rid of that, some paint, and just lighten it right down. Do I want to make that darker? A little bit darker down here. So I'll go back, pick up some more of that cobalt, a little bit of, a little bit of the brown I use, and just bring that down here particularly. The paper's wet. It's sort of painting itself still. I'm looking to keep as much as possible this sort of the atmosphere of the light burning in onto the water. I wonder how that's going to work. Okay, I'm going to call that now the end of the third stage, and come into the fourth stage in a moment. I'll talk about it, what we might need to do in that fourth stage. Not much, I suspect, in this painting, and that should conclude the painting. Right. I'll give that a little dry, and then move on into the fourth stage. Part of this stage is just thinking, what do we need to do to make it work? Let me stand away from the painting. I think all I need to do is put some highlights in. So I get my my white gouache out. Get some clean water. And use my rigger brush. So rigger brush. And where do I want little bits to stand out? So straight into the tube with my rigger brush. I'll just put it on here so I get an idea what's going to come off. And where do I need to put a little bit of light? In many places, just a little bit there, maybe. On the side of this mast. Again, this lost and found thing that I mentioned to you. I've left some light here, but I don't need to do anything about that. Where else did this? A little bit on that. What about here? You must make up your own mind as to where you want to put this, how much you want to do that. Don't be too slavish to the photograph. A little bit up here, maybe a bit more here. Enough. And I'm not going to put any more darker accents in here. Do I need to do any rubbing out? I'll do this when everything's dry anyway. Let's just. There was a man Lois will know well. He used to paint at the watermill. In fact, I probably more or less took over from me really. John Christian. He lived near me in Devon. Very, very good watercolorist. And he always put birds into his paintings, specifically, what are they called? Birds of prey of some kind. Where's our rubber go? And as a sort of affectation, if you like, or whatever, you always could recognize his paintings because he had some buzzards flying around. Well, I'm going to do the same. Just to break up this area here, almost as a compositional feature. So I'm picking up something that's dark and sludgy. I don't know if it would be dark enough. And let's put a couple of John Christian birds in. One, two, put one in down. I don't know how many. He'd do this a lot better than I would, because I don't know quite where to put these birds. It's just thinking of it, something. Yeah. I hope you like those, Lois, those birds. Right, everybody, that's where I'll leave the painting. Abandon it anyway. It may be that you come back to a painting later on and decide that you'll do a little bit more to it, but generally speaking, don't do that. I don't mind a few little pencil marks in there. I'll just get rid of some of the marks in the sky.